The glass slipped from her hand, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. But it wasn't the spill that made her freeze. It was what she saw next. Something she was never supposed to see. And within 24 hours, they knew she knew. The room went quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, like every sound had been swallowed at once. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, eyes shifted without turning heads, and for a brief second, no one moved. Emily Carter had spent years learning how to exist without being noticed, how to clean around people without interrupting their world, how to disappear even while standing in the same room. But in that moment, she felt every gaze pressing against her, even the ones that refused to meet her eyes. She bent down quickly, apologizing under her breath, trying to gather the broken pieces of glass with shaking hands, hoping that if she moved fast enough, she could undo what had already been done. Because what she had seen was not meant for someone like her. It wasn't meant for anyone outside that table. And yet, there she was, caught in a moment she couldn't erase, holding on to a truth that had already begun to place her in danger. Emily had always believed that keeping her head down was enough to stay safe. She followed every rule, stayed quiet, did her job, and left without asking questions. That was how she survived. That was how she provided for her son, a quiet 8-year-old boy who believed his mother could fix anything, who waited for her every evening with stories about school and dreams that stretched far beyond the small apartment they called home. She never let him see how tired she was, never let him feel the weight she carried, because in his eyes, she wasn't just a maid. She was everything. And everything she did, every long shift, every silent moment, was for him. But that night changed something. It wasn't just what she saw. It was the way the room responded, the way silence turned into something heavy, something deliberate. One of the men at the table slowly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor in a way that made her flinch. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. The look on his face said enough. It was the kind of look that didn't belong in a moment like that, the kind that made your instincts tell you to leave, to run, to forget whatever had just happened. But Emily couldn't run. Not yet. She forced herself to keep her head down, to finish cleaning, to act as though nothing had changed. But everything had. And somewhere in that house, behind closed doors and lowered voices, a decision was already being made about her. This is the story of how one quiet maid uncovered a secret, and how powerful people tried to erase her for it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who were they really? Not just the well-dressed figures seated around that table, not just the polished smiles and measured voices, but the people behind the image, the ones who could turn a quiet dinner into something that left a woman like Emily Carter frozen in place. What did she see that night that made the air change so quickly, that turned a simple mistake into a moment that could not be taken back? And how far would someone go to keep a secret buried when the person who witnessed it was never supposed to matter in the first place? Because Emily wasn't supposed to be part of their world. She was hired to clean it, to move through it without leaving a trace, to remain invisible no matter what passed in front of her. But that night, invisibility failed her. The house itself stood like a fortress, tucked away from the noise of the city, surrounded by high gates and quiet security that watched more than it showed. It was the kind of place where everything looked perfect from the outside, where nothing seemed out of place, and yet something about it always felt controlled, as if every detail had been carefully arranged to hide what didn't belong. Emily had noticed it before in small ways, in the way certain rooms were always locked, in the way conversations stopped when she entered, in the way the staff were expected to follow rules that were never fully explained. She had learned not to question it. Questions didn't belong in a place like that. But now, the questions were unavoidable. What had happened at that table wasn't an accident, and the reactions that followed made that clear. The way one man immediately checked the doors, the way another lowered his voice to a near whisper, the way no one called for help right away. It was as if they all understood something that Emily was only beginning to grasp. And then there was the silence afterward, the kind that lingers long after a moment has passed, the kind that settles into your thoughts and refuses to leave. Within hours, small things began to shift. A phone call that ended too quickly. A glance held a second too long. Instructions repeated more firmly than usual. It wasn't open confrontation, not yet, but it didn't need to be. Emily could feel it. They were watching her now, not as part of the background, but as someone who had crossed an invisible line. And if what she saw truly mattered, if it was something worth hiding, then the real question wasn't just what happened that night. The real question was what they were willing to do next. Long before that night, before the silence at the table and the weight of unseen eyes following her every move, Emily Carter had already learned how to survive in a world that rarely noticed people like her. Her mornings began early, long before the sun fully rose, in a small apartment where everything had its place and nothing was wasted. Every action in her day carried purpose, from the way she prepared for work to the quiet determination that pushed her through long hours. She lived a life built on discipline, not comfort, and she carried herself with a dignity that didn't depend on recognition. Emily was not loud, not expressive in ways that drew attention, but she saw everything. Years of working in other people's homes had taught her that silence was often safer, that listening revealed more than speaking ever could. It was a skill she relied on, especially in places where power spoke in subtle ways. By the time she arrived at the estate each day, she stepped into a different world, one that operated on control, precision, and an image that had to be maintained at all costs. The house belonged to a man whose influence extended far beyond what most people could see, a businessman known for his calculated decisions and a reputation that remained carefully protected. To outsiders, he represented success and stability, the kind of man who commanded respect without ever needing to demand it. But inside the walls of that house, there was a different kind of order, one that relied on silence just as much as authority. Conversations shifted when he entered a room, movements became more careful, and even the smallest details felt managed in a way that left little room for mistakes. Emily noticed these things, not because she was looking for trouble, but because her role required her to be aware of everything while pretending to notice nothing. She cleaned around closed doors she was never meant to open, walked past conversations that ended the moment she appeared, and followed routines that were never fully explained but always expected. And through it all, she remained invisible, just as they preferred. Yet beneath that routine, there was a quiet distance in her life, a sense of standing between two worlds without fully belonging to either. She returned home each night to a space that was hers, to a life that depended entirely on her ability to endure, but the contrast never left her. She carried the silence of that house with her, the unspoken tension that lingered in certain rooms, the feeling that something important existed just out of sight. Emily had seen many things in that house, things she chose not to question, moments she allowed to pass without meaning. But never anything like what she saw that night. In the weeks leading up to that night, the house began to feel different in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Emily Carter had always understood that certain things were not meant for her attention, that her role was to move quietly through the background without disrupting the lives unfolding around her. But even within those boundaries, patterns existed, routines that gave the house a sense of predictability. And slowly, those patterns began to shift. It started with the visitors. They didn't arrive during the day when everything was open and visible. They came late, long after the usual rhythm of the house had settled, their presence marked by the sound of tires on gravel and doors closing more carefully than usual. Emily noticed how their visits were never announced, how the atmosphere changed the moment they stepped inside, how conversations became shorter, sharper, more controlled. Then there were the rooms. Certain doors that had always been closed now felt deliberately guarded, as if their importance had suddenly increased. She would pass by them during her work, catching the faintest sounds from inside, voices lowered to a level that suggested urgency rather than privacy. Sometimes she would pause for just a second too long, not out of curiosity, but because something about those moments felt heavier than they should. And then there were the conversations she was never meant to hear. Fragments of sentences carried through hallways, names mentioned quickly and then corrected, tones that shifted the moment footsteps approached. Emily had trained herself not to react, to keep moving, to let those fragments pass without meaning. At first she ignored it. That was the rule. See nothing. Say nothing. Keep your job. It had always been enough before. It had always kept her safe. But the more she tried to hold on to that rule, the harder it became to believe that what was happening around her was ordinary. The tension wasn't just in what she heard, but in what she felt. in the way the house seemed to hold its breath at certain times, in the way people looked over their shoulders before speaking, in the way silence followed her more closely than it used to. One evening, as she moved down a dim hallway finishing the last of her tasks, she noticed a door slightly open, just enough to reveal movement inside. She hadn't meant to look, hadn't meant to notice, but something about the stillness around that moment made it impossible to ignore. Through that narrow gap, she saw silhouettes shifting, figures standing closer than conversation alone would require, their voices low but tense in a way that carried even without clear words. She stood there for a second longer than she should have, her instincts telling her to move, to leave, to return to the safety of routine. And then one of the voices inside rose just enough to break through the silence, sharp and controlled, followed by another voice trying to bring it back down. Emily stepped away immediately, her heart beating faster than she could explain, her mind already trying to dismiss what she had just witnessed as something that didn't concern her. But something had changed. The line she had always respected, the one that kept her separate from whatever existed behind those closed doors, no longer felt as clear as it once had. And whether she wanted it or not, she was beginning to cross into a space she could not easily leave. But one night, the rules changed. That night began like so many others, with quiet preparation and a routine that gave no indication of what was about to unfold. Emily Carter arrived earlier than usual, moving through the kitchen with practiced precision as the staff coordinated the final details of a private dinner. The guest list was small but deliberate, a handful of individuals whose presence carried a certain weight, men who spoke carefully and observed even more carefully. The atmosphere felt controlled, almost rehearsed, as if every element of the evening had been planned to the smallest detail. Emily kept her focus where it belonged, setting the table, adjusting placements, ensuring everything reflected the standard expected in a house like this. Yet beneath the surface, there was something else, something harder to define. The conversations that began as polite exchanges carried an edge that didn't quite fit the setting, and the pauses between them felt longer than they should. As the evening settled in, Emily moved in and out of the dining room, refilling glasses, clearing plates, maintaining the rhythm she had perfected over time. She avoided eye contact, kept her movements quiet, did everything she could to remain unnoticed. But even without looking directly, she could feel the shift in the room. Voices began to tighten, laughter faded more quickly, and one particular exchange at the table seemed to linger longer than the rest. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. The change came suddenly, without warning, in the middle of what should have been an ordinary moment. A voice rose, sharper than before, cutting through the controlled calm that had defined the evening. Another voice followed, lower but firm, as if trying to contain what was already slipping out of control. Emily stepped closer, not out of curiosity, but because the tension had broken the rhythm she relied on, forcing her into a moment she could not ignore. And then it happened. The glass slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that echoed louder than it should have. Red liquid spread quickly across the white tablecloth, drawing attention to a moment that had already begun to unravel. But it wasn't the spill that held her there. It was what she saw next. One of the men at the table had risen halfway from his seat, his expression no longer controlled, his composure breaking in a way that didn't match the image he had maintained all evening. Another figure stood abruptly, the movement sudden and unsteady, followed by a brief struggle that lasted only seconds but carried a weight that lingered far longer. Then came the collapse. It was quick, almost too quick to process, a body falling in a way that didn't look accidental, followed by a silence that felt immediate and absolute. For a second, no one moved. And then everything shifted at once. Chairs scraped back, voices dropped into urgent whispers, and the calm that had defined the evening disappeared completely. Emily stood frozen, her hands still trembling, her mind trying to catch up with what her eyes had already confirmed. Someone moved toward the fallen man, not with panic, but with a kind of controlled urgency that suggested this was not entirely unexpected. Another figure turned toward Emily briefly, their gaze sharp, calculating, as if assessing how much she had seen, how much she understood. She looked down immediately, instinct taking over, her body urging her to disappear, to step back into the role that had always protected her. But it was too late. The moment had already passed, and with it, the safety she had relied on for so long. The room no longer felt like a place she could move through unnoticed. It felt like a place where every presence was accounted for, where every action carried meaning. And in that moment, Emily realized something she could not ignore. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple mistake that could be explained away or forgotten. It was something far more serious, something that had been building long before she ever walked into that room. And the way everyone reacted, the speed with which silence replaced chaos, the absence of any real attempt to call for help, told her everything she needed to know. And that's when Emily realized this wasn't just a mistake. It was something much worse. In the hours that followed, Emily Carter did what she had trained herself to do for years. She continued working. She cleaned what needed to be cleaned, moved where she was expected to move, and kept her head down as though nothing had changed. On the surface, everything returned to order with a speed that felt almost rehearsed. The table was cleared, the broken glass was gone, and the room was restored to the same polished state it had been in before the night unraveled. But beneath that surface, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Emily could feel it in the air, in the way silence settled more heavily than usual, in the way every step she took seemed louder than before. She avoided looking directly at anyone, but she didn't need to. She could feel the attention now, subtle but constant, following her through the halls in a way that hadn't existed before. They didn't say anything, but their eyes did. It was in the brief pauses when she entered a room, in the way conversations ended just a second too quickly, in the way someone always seemed to be nearby when she moved from one task to another. It wasn't open suspicion, not yet, but it was enough to make her aware that she was no longer invisible. For the first time, she felt like part of the room, not as a worker, but as a presence that needed to be accounted for. The shift became more noticeable the next day. Simple questions began to surface, asked in calm tones that carried more weight than they should have. Where had she been the night before? Had she finished her duties at the usual time? Did she notice anything unusual? Each question was framed casually, almost as part of routine conversation, but the repetition made their purpose clear. Emily answered carefully, choosing her words with precision, giving nothing more than what was necessary. She kept her voice steady, her expression neutral, doing everything she could to maintain the role that had always protected her. But even as she spoke, she could sense that her answers were being measured, evaluated for something deeper than their surface meaning. Outside of the house, things began to change as well. Calls that should have been returned went unanswered. Messages sent were met with silence. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence, but the pattern became harder to ignore with each passing hour. The world beyond those walls, the one place she had always been able to return to without question, now felt slightly out of reach, as if something unseen had begun to interfere. Back inside the house, the tension continued to build in quiet ways. One afternoon, as Emily returned to the small room where staff kept their belongings, she noticed something immediately. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but small details were out of place. A drawer that had been closed was slightly open. Items she had arranged carefully were no longer where she had left them. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but the message was clear. Someone had been there. Someone had gone through her things, not to take anything, but to look, to check, to confirm something they already suspected. Emily stood still for a moment, her mind racing through possibilities she couldn't fully process, her instincts telling her to remain calm, to show no reaction. She closed the drawer slowly, adjusted what had been moved, and stepped back into the routine as though nothing had happened. But the sense of safety she once felt was gone. Later that evening, as she moved through the hallway, one of the men from the night before passed by her without stopping. For a moment, it seemed like nothing more than a simple crossing of paths. But as he walked past, his voice, low and controlled, reached her just enough to be heard. Some secrets are better left alone. He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't need to. The words hung in the air long after he was gone, carrying a meaning that left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. And for the first time since that night, Emily Carter understood that whatever she had seen had placed her in a position she could not easily escape. By the time the warning reached her, Emily Carter understood that staying silent might no longer be enough to protect her. For days, she tried to convince herself that distance was the safest choice, that if she kept her routine intact and avoided anything that drew attention, the tension would eventually fade. But the feeling didn't fade. It followed her, growing heavier with every unanswered question, every careful glance, every moment that reminded her she had seen something she was never meant to see. And slowly, that fear began to shift into something else. Not recklessness, but a quiet need for clarity. Because whatever had happened that night was not being treated like an accident, and the way everyone moved afterward suggested a level of control that went far beyond a single moment. Emily didn't set out to investigate in the way people imagine. There was no plan, no sudden decision to uncover the truth. It began with small things, moments where instinct guided her attention in ways she could no longer ignore. A file left briefly unattended, a drawer not fully closed, a room that had been locked now accessible for just long enough to raise questions. She moved carefully, aware of the risks, aware that even a second too long in the wrong place could confirm suspicions that were already forming. One afternoon, while completing a task in a part of the house she was rarely assigned to, she noticed something that made her pause. A desk drawer, slightly open, just enough to reveal the edge of documents that didn't belong in plain sight. She hesitated, her instincts warning her to step away, to leave things exactly as they were. But something stronger held her there, something tied to the memory of that night and the silence that followed. Slowly, she reached forward, opening the drawer just enough to see what was inside. The papers were neatly arranged, organized in a way that suggested importance rather than oversight. Names appeared first, unfamiliar at a glance, but repeated enough to stand out. Dates followed, spaced in a pattern that felt deliberate. And then there were details, fragments of information that didn't make sense on their own, but began to form a picture the longer she looked. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted one of the pages, her eyes scanning quickly, trying to absorb as much as possible without losing track of time. It wasn't just records. It was evidence of something structured, something that had been happening long before she ever stepped into that house. Incidents that had been contained, situations that had been resolved without attention, patterns that repeated in ways that could not be explained by coincidence. Emily's breath slowed as the realization began to settle in. What she had witnessed that night wasn't an isolated moment. It wasn't a single mistake or a sudden loss of control. It was part of something larger, something that had been managed carefully, hidden behind layers of silence and authority. She returned the papers exactly as she found them, closing the drawer with the same precision she used in everything else, her mind already racing ahead of her actions. The house felt different now, not just tense, but calculated in a way she hadn't fully understood before. Every locked door, every late-night visit, every whispered conversation took on new meaning, forming connections that had been invisible to her until now. And as she stepped away from that room, one thought stayed with her more clearly than anything else. What she found proved this wasn't the first time. The more Emily Carter allowed herself to connect what she had seen with what she had found, the harder it became to hold on to the idea that this was something contained, something limited to a single moment that had gone wrong. The documents were not chaotic or hidden in panic. They were organized, precise, almost clinical in the way they recorded events that should never have been reduced to paper. Dates that stretched back further than she expected. Names that appeared once, then never again. Brief descriptions that avoided detail but hinted at outcomes that required control, not chance. It was the consistency that made it undeniable. Whatever happened in that dining room had happened before, not in the exact same way, but close enough to follow a pattern that had been repeated, adjusted, and perfected over time. Emily began to understand why the reactions that night had felt so controlled, why no one had panicked in the way people do when something unexpected occurs. Because to them, it wasn't unexpected. It was a situation they knew how to manage. The pieces started to fall into place in ways that made the silence surrounding everything feel deliberate. The late-night visitors were no longer just guests. The locked rooms were not just private spaces. The whispered conversations were not casual exchanges. They were part of something structured, something that relied on discretion at every level. And then there was the protection. It wasn't written directly, but it didn't need to be. Certain names carried weight, appearing alongside references that suggested influence beyond the walls of the house. mentions of resolved issues that never reached public attention, situations handled internally, outcomes controlled before they could become problems. It painted a picture of a system that didn't depend on chance, but on connections, on power, on the ability to keep things contained no matter how serious they were. Emily could feel the weight of that realization settle in, heavier than anything she had experienced before. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was about a network of decisions, of actions taken and covered without question, of people who understood exactly what they were doing and had the means to ensure it stayed hidden. And in that moment, the fear she had been carrying shifted into something deeper, something more defined. Because if this had been happening for so long without consequence, then the real danger wasn't just what she had seen. It was what it meant for her now that she knew. This wasn't just one secret, it was a system built on silence. By the time Emily Carter understood the full weight of what she had uncovered, she also understood that staying meant becoming part of the silence she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. The house no longer felt like a place of routine or structure. It felt controlled in a way that left no room for mistakes, and she knew she had already made one simply by seeing too much. Every passing hour carried the same quiet pressure, the same awareness that her presence was being measured, that her actions were being watched more closely than before. She began to plan carefully, not out of panic, but with the same discipline that had guided her through everything else in her life. She kept her movements consistent, her behavior unchanged, giving no indication that anything had shifted inside her. But beneath that calm surface, she was preparing to leave, not just the house, but everything connected to it. The evidence she had seen could not stay hidden forever, and if she remained, neither could she. The night she chose to act, she moved with quiet precision, taking only what she needed, avoiding anything that would draw attention too soon. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't leave a trace that could be easily followed. She simply stepped out of the life she had built and into something uncertain, carrying with her the truth that others had worked so hard to bury. What followed was not immediate exposure or sudden justice. It was slower, more deliberate. Information surfaced in places it couldn't be easily controlled. Questions began to reach beyond the walls of that house. And while no single moment revealed everything at once, the pattern Emily had discovered began to unravel piece by piece, forcing attention onto things that had remained hidden for far too long. But even then, not everything was resolved. Not every name was held accountable. Not every truth was fully revealed. Because systems built on silence do not collapse all at once. They resist, they adapt, they protect themselves in ways that are not always visible. Emily Carter was no longer part of that world, but the impact of what she had uncovered remained, moving through channels she could no longer see, changing things in ways that would never be fully acknowledged. And in the end, one truth remained clearer than anything else. Some stories don't end with justice. They end with silence. What would you have done if you were in Emily Carter's position? If you walked into a room one ordinary night and saw something that could change everything, something that powerful people were determined to keep hidden, would you stay silent and protect yourself, or would you risk everything to expose the truth? It's easy to believe we know what we would do, but moments like that don't come with time to prepare. They happen quickly, and the consequences stay long after. Emily didn't go looking for answers. She didn't choose to be part of that world, but once she saw it, there was no way to unsee it, no way to return to the life she had before. And that's what makes stories like this stay with us, because they force us to ask questions we don't always have answers to. Let us know in the comments what you would have done and where you're watching from, because your perspective matters more than you think. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you think twice about the things we often overlook, then there's another story waiting that will challenge you even more. Subscribe for more real-life stories that stay with you long after they end.